Okay. Everybody stop futzing around and listen to my story, because I have a story. Not just any story. A love story. We like those here on BookTube, right? I think so. Anyway, there once was a beautiful princess who lived, I guess not in a castle, but in a city with a castle in it. However, she did give tours of the castle. And one day, a prince who came from a faraway land took a tour with her. So it was love at first sight, but it was a forbidden love. Or it would have been a few decades ago, but that's neither here nor there. Let's just pretend it was for, like, the drama's sake. See, the princess's people were, I guess to put it delicately, not fans of the prince's people, but nevertheless, the princess and prince's love proved to be stronger than the hate and the history that would have torn them apart. Aww. And that is how my parents got married on the Nazi Party rally grounds in Nuremberg, Germany. Woo! Now I'm sure you're thinking, A, how incredibly badass, and B, wouldn't that make you a Mischling ersten Grades? To which I would say, why yes, thank you for noticing. But why start with this incredible origin story of epic romance and star-crossed lovers? Well, I wanted to explain how it came to be that I picked up this gem of a book at Barnes & Noble. I kind of have this like special relationship with my identity where it's just safe enough that I would probably maybe survive the looming fascist dictatorship, but just complicated enough where it makes for an interesting anecdote over like whiskey maybe, which I'm not allowed to drink, but I've heard it can really spice up an evening of. Anyways, moving on. The Heaven and Earth grocery store is technically a murder mystery, but unlike most murder mysteries, it doesn't suck. This is probably because it is only barely a murder mystery, to its credit. It takes place in a little community called Chicken Hill and follows the Black and Jewish folk who live there, as well as the relationship between them. Now the author, James McBride, is, like me, half Jewish. Except, of course, he's technically considered fully Jewish because he's Jewish on his mother's side, and I guess that just makes me chopped liver. But putting aside my personal feud with the Hellenic conventions of matrilineal descent, God, I really hope I pronounced that right, the story of the Heaven and Earth grocery store is an excellent mediation on America and her many, many flaws, as well as on the indomitable and beautifully diverse human spirit. And finally, the main topic of this video, the hierarchy of minorities. What do I mean when I talk about the hierarchy of minorities? More specifically, the American hierarchy of minorities. Well, for that we need a history lesson. Welcome to the classroom. Today we're going to Today we're going to take a blast into the past and explore the melting pot that is the United States of America. Most of us are familiar with the Great Creation myth. Not the Adam and Eve one, the far more important American one. You know, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and all that jazz until he eventually discovered America, or India, whatever he thought he had done. But moving past the story of America's first and favorite bad excuse for a holiday, there's another story that holds just as strong a place in the American zeitgeist, or as I like to call it, the criminal offense behind the emergence of deep-fried turkey and obnoxious football dads. I'm talking, of course, about the first Thanksgiving. For anyone who was lucky enough to never be subjected to the American public school system, here's a quick rundown. The English, more specifically the English church, were being, surprise surprise, difficult. There was this group of punks who were big on the First Amendment religion shtick before the First Amendment existed. They really wanted to follow their own religious practices, which were, in all honesty, not really all that different from what the Church of England preached, but it was still separate from what the church did, and so they were kicked out of England. Which sucks, of course, but the English also have like fried tomatoes and beans for breakfast, so I don't really know how much they were actually missing out on. I digress. At some point in their exile, the aforementioned punks decided to hop on this little ship you may have heard of called the Mayflower and sail away to America, where they believed they would be able to practice their religion freely. Now, there's a bunch more I could get into about what happened once they got to America and the social and historical implications about that, but this video is already complicated enough without bringing yet another genocide into it, so I'm going to leave that topic to someone else. The main takeaway I'm going to be focusing on here is that since its founding, America has been seen as a place where various groups could go to in order to be free and escape oppression. Great. Now let's talk about slavery. Other than the indigenous populations, there is one minority in America which differs itself distinctly from other minorities in how they fit into American society. While other groups like Jews, Asians, Latinos, and more may face oppression, at the same time, the vast majority of them came to America in order to escape oppression, be it social, economic, religious, or otherwise. African Americans are set apart here because they did not choose to come to America. Their oppression began in America, the place they were forcefully brought to, and from where they were sold into slavery. I assume most of you are familiar with the horrible details of American slavery, but for those who are not, just know it was brutal, dehumanizing, and I'd call it inhumane, but it seems that we've proven time and time again that this is just the sort of thing that humans do to each other. America, in particular the white folk who ran it, continued to treat black people horribly, up to and continuing after the war which was fought regarding, among other things, the enslavement of the people living in this so-called free country. After the Civil War was won by the Union and African Americans officially became free citizens of this country, you'd think we'd have realized the error of our ways and, done better. However, this of course did not happen because, as you may recall me indicating, we are humans and humans suck. Ergo, black people are continuously treated horribly in this country all the way up to the start and eventual legal success of the civil rights movement. Think like Jim Crow, lynchings, and like general one-on-one racism. So I mention all this to lay the foundations for understanding the complicated relationship between the Black and Jewish communities. Both are groups who have faced extreme historic violence, as well as modern-day discrimination and oppression. But just as essential is knowing their similarities or knowing their differences. See, somewhat like the Pilgrims, the European Jews were, how does one put it, not welcome? Or particularly liked by anyone. That is for a whole plethora of reasons, including, but not limited to, that we were encouraged to be filthy moneylenders, making a very small percentage of us obnoxiously rich, which of course led to a lot of envy and resentment as the wealth was perceived to be amassed through exploitative and not Christian ways? Yeah. Oh, and we killed Christ. Now, of course, this is a gross oversimplification, both on my part and on the part of the anti-Semites. For one, there were a lot of poor Jews. This especially depended on the region. For another, not everyone was a moneylender. Some of us created communism. I'm kidding. Marx was barely a Jew. But to, put it simply, being a Jew, honestly, anywhere, was not really a walk in the park. Funnily enough, circling back to Columbus, a little more than a month after he set sail off the edge of the world, all the Jews had been kicked out of Spain because why not, I guess? It's not actually really that funny when you think about it, but basically this just happened a lot. More than you'd expect, or I don't know, maybe you expected this much, I don't know, but you get my drift. This Goy on Jew violence reached not its peak, but its worst up to that point in the late 19th century. There were these things called pogroms, which were basically Russian phenomenons where a big angry mob, more or less straight out of one of those bad Frankenstein movies, would violently expel or massacre the Jewish populations in their cities and villages. These pogroms were on the uptick, and the Jews were not having it. Between 1880 and 1924, over 2 million Jews left Europe for the United States. And when I say Europe, I mean from all across Europe. Germany, Lithuania, Romania, Poland, you name it. Lots of Jews going to the US. Okay, I think we're now basically caught up to the time period where our book takes place. The Heaven and Earth grocery store starts out in the Roaring 20s, goes right up into the rise of the failed painter turned Aryan Antichrist, and gives us a small glimpse into their future, which is our modern day 1970s. Now that we're all somewhat familiar with the social, political, and economic standings of these two groups, we can truly dive deeper into the question I posed at the start. What is the American hierarchy of minorities? And how does this book, in showcasing it, predict the solution to it? Since this is a term that I think, coined, I get to decide its definition. Woo! So, for all to know and abide by, I declare that, from here on out, the American hierarchy of minorities refers to the phenomenon in America where different minorities and subsections of minorities are pitted against each other, resulting in a society that requires groups attempting assimilation to always have a group beneath them in order to be progressively accepted into the dominant culture. This is a lot to break down. I don't know, or maybe it seems obvious to you. Yeah, but also, I don't care. I like talking about this. I did it my way. So let's see how the story can help us to further understand this concept. Moshe, who might be seen as the main perspective of the novel, is a Jew from Romania, a self-described fuskeya, or wandering Jew, who found his success in America. He owns both a dance hall / theater, as well as the Heaven and Earth grocery store, this book's eponym. He lives with his wife, Chona, who throughout the story acts as an almost Jesus-like figure, bringing the Black and Jewish communities together through her strength of heart and character. In his employment is another major character of the story, Nate, who is a Black man. His wife, Addie, is Chona's close friend. Now, what sets Moshe and Chona apart from the other Jews is that, at this point, most of the Jews have moved out of Chicken Hill and onto, bigger and better things. Basically, they're joining the WASPs. This is called social mobility, which is available to some groups in America more than others. However, this social mobility does come at a cost: assimilation and the ensuing loss of culture. This is specifically relevant to the Jewish experience due to something known as the Jewish diaspora. A thing that I really do not feel like talking about because I know no matter what I say, it's probably gonna piss somebody off, and I have the deeply sick and annoyingly unachievable desire to be liked by everyone, which is really not conducive to doing anything online. But I digress. Also, I will have to talk about this thing one way or another later in the video, so I might as well just get started now. The Jewish diaspora is the dispersion of the Israelites, aka the Jews, out of their ancestral homeland. Now, there are a lot of religious people who believe that it is the, Jewish destiny to return to their homeland, and if you're an evangelical Christian, set off the apocalypse. Now, to be fully transparent, I'm more of a spiritual person than a religious one, so that's, not really my thing, but I do have a lot of sympathy for this feeling of being severed from your roots and trying to hold on to the scraps of your history and culture that you have left. Yeah. I think most people whose parents are immigrants or people who belong to an, in some way, marginalized culture know that feeling. Now, does this justify certain actions? Well, like I said, we'll touch on that later in the video. I did, however, want to set up one more facet of what is at stake here in this American hierarchy of minorities. Even if you are towards the top of the hierarchy and are therefore assimilated, there is a certain tragedy to it and a sense of mourning people feel. But back to the story now. This tension regarding assimilation is very much present in Moshe and Chona's relationship, as Moshe continues to want to move upwards in the hierarchy of minorities, while Chona feels a deep connection to Judaism and an aversion to assimilation, as well as a deep love of the Heaven and Earth grocery store, which she runs and Moshe funds, despite it proving to be continuously unprofitable. The Heaven and Earth grocery store can be read to symbolize a certain loyalty to the community and a refusal to partake in an unfair society, even when one is in the position to, and even when it would be the smarter or safer thing to do. Instances of her distributing food for free to families in need or hungry children demonstrates this. With the setting and circumstance of the book introduced and dissected, I think it just now probably makes sense to provide you with a brief plot summary in order to more properly break down the themes and societal implications of McBride's novel. So where to begin? Probably with a spoiler warning. Yeah, that sounds good. A spoiler warning is now in effect. I know you know the drill, but if you do decide to go on regardless of spoilers, I would recommend reading the book anyway, because there are just so many small stories and beautiful descriptions within the greater tale that I would be remiss if I did not encourage you to read it anyway. Plus, it's just good manners. A future classic like this deserves our generation's admittedly limited attention. Okay, so the Heaven and Earth grocery store opens in Chicken Hill circa early 1970s, right before Hurricane Agnes raged and ravaged the land, resulting in much damage. I assume some death and the disappearance of the last Jew in Chicken Hill. Right before the hurricane hit, the police uncovered a corpse carrying a mezuzah, but it's not just any corpse, and it certainly isn't just any mezuzah. This mezuzah is engraved with the words, "Home to the greatest dancer in the world," and belongs to said last Jew in Chicken Hill. Naturally, the police must find and question him, thereby introducing to the narrative Malachi, an old friend of Moshe's. The prologue ends with Hurricane Agnes hitting Pennsylvania and taking away with it the corpse, as well as Malachi, who is never heard from again. But who is Malachi? Where did he get the mezuzah from? And how did he know Moshe? Well, Malachi is a friend of Moshe's, and the mezuzah was a gift from him. As for the last question, welcome back to the 20s! Moshe is struggling to establish his theater/dance hall and decides to put on a major music event. This event is largely successful and leads to his first encounter with Malachi, who declares he will dance with no women, and then proceeds to dance with every woman. There are a few snags on the way, as there is some issue with Moshe reaching his fellow Jews, many of whom immigrated from different parts of the world and speak a variety of native tongues. This introduces the idea of divisions and hierarchies within minorities, which adds yet another dimension to this strange overarching system. A bit more than a decade passes before Moshe encounters Malachi again. However, after a failed stint in Chicken Hill as an atrocious baker whose god-awful shatla may or may not have magical healing properties, Malachi leaves again to return to Europe during the beginning of a rather pivotal time in that continent's history, leaving Moshe with the parting words, "We are integrating into a burning house." Meanwhile, Nate and Addie are given the responsibility over their 12-year-old deaf nephew, Dodo, after Addie's sister passes away. Due to his disability, the authorities want to take Dodo to Penhurst School, which they call a special school, which is of course a euphemism for an institution that was so violent and brutal towards its mentally unwell inmates that it was eventually shut down in 1987. For obvious reasons, Nate and Addie do not want Dodo there, so they ask Moshe and Chona to take him in and hide him until the authorities lose interest. They do this rather successfully, with the help of their neighbor and Chona's former childhood friend, Bernice Davis, for some time. However, it is a book, and books are about life, and as we all know, nothing ever goes well in life or in books. The character Doc Roberts is the run-of-the-mill racist of the story, and by that I mean, of course, an incredibly nuanced and dissecting portrayal of a man who has taken the Hippocratic Oath and is also a KKK member. Doc Roberts joins in on the efforts to find Dodo and enters the Heaven and Earth grocery store while Dodo is in the back. Chona tries to distract the doctor but ends up having a seizure due to her aforementioned health issues. Doc Roberts proves not only to be a bigot but also a thief and a rapist, as he uses the opportunity to steal Malachi's mezuzah, which was in Chona's possession at the time, and assault Chona. Or try to, that is, because Dodo stops him and is subsequently captured by the police. It seems that no good deed goes unpunished counts twice as often when you're black. Especially when you're a black man, or in Dodo's case, boy. The aftermath of this is all rather tragic. Dodo is sent to Penhurst. Chona is brought to a hospital, where she dies a week later. As they say, Jesus figure see, Jesus figure do. In all seriousness, though, it is really very sad, and probably the most touching scene of the novel. The chapter is called The Hot Dog, which sounds maybe a bit banal, but it is in reference to what is probably my favorite metaphor for death that I have ever read. If you want me to elaborate, do please ask me in the comments. It will make my day. Anyway, in wake of Chona's death, various townspeople begin to entertain ideas of rescuing Dodo. This effort is made more urgent by the presence of the infamous Son of Man, an attendant at Penhurst who sexually abuses the patients. Dodo has already become familiar with him, as well with another inmate who he nicknames Monkey Pants on account of not knowing his actual name. The boy saves him from being raped by Son of Man at the cost of his own life. Soon after, Nate carries out a rescue plan that I don't quite feel like going into the details of, but to summarize, he saves Dodo and kills Son of Man. They manage to escape to South Carolina, and Addie is not far behind. There, Dodo lives a happy life and dies surrounded by his children at a ripe age, just as Hurricane Agnes hits Pottstown. But what about the corpse at the start of the book? Well, this happens on the same night as the escape from Penhurst. The water pipelines to the synagogue are undergoing a somewhat less than legal construction, and Pottstown is celebrating Memorial Day, of all things. They are doing some Civil War reenactment, like BS, and Doc Roberts is in the thick of it, getting drunk, and pretty much spouting more Great Replacement theory conspiracies than Tucker Carlson if he were overdosing on speed. Anyway, he switches costumes and decides to be red, aka British, instead of blue, aka American. This leads to a strongman sent to collect a debt from some guy who is supposed to be wearing a red uniform, going after Doc Roberts. This has expected consequences, with Doc Roberts being accidentally pushed down the manhole left uncovered for the less than legal construction. All the while, Doc Roberts is carrying the mezuzah, and he dies with the mezuzah. I feel at this point I owe you a review more extensive than it was good, or that it was a 5-star read. So let's see. As mentioned before, I truly do believe that this book will become a future classic, and if it doesn't, it most certainly should be. I think it's really relevant to the times we live in the sense that here in America, identity has always been a rather large part of society, but we have never spoken so much about identity as we do today. The idea of this is largely to counter the well-meaning narrative of we are all the same, and replace it with we are different, but it's not a bad thing, and we should celebrate and share with each other that which makes us unique. I think this is probably a healthier way of dealing with our country's fraught past of bigotry than just ignoring it. Though I do have a lot of sympathy for the initial idea of shifting our focus more towards our shared humanity. I believe McBride does both in his novel, actually. He highlights the differences between, for example, Chona and Bernice, by demonstrating how despite sharing a similar struggle in America, Bernice is discriminated against to a far greater extent. At the same time, he does not ignore their shared humanity. Though Chona is privileged in many ways and Bernice is not, they are both willing to put themselves at risk in order to hide and protect Dodo. But forgive me that tangent. The point I was planning to make is that the Heaven and Earth grocery store is not just relevant to our times, it is also subtly critical of them. There has long been a connection between the Jewish American and African American communities, but the connection is rather complicated. I hesitate to go into this as I'm afraid to overcomplicate things, but also, complicated issues are complicated due to the nature of being complicated, and sometimes, even if one is unable to comprehend the issue due to its complexity, I do believe in the virtue of simply understanding that an issue is complex. So, here goes nothing. Though there are tensions that existed even, back in the day between Jews and blacks, as I have established previously in this video, there is, in general, this historical alliance between the two communities. This was especially noticeable during the civil rights movement, where a disproportionate number of white Jews were involved in the protests. However, the most famous picture that usually comes to mind is Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and Martin Luther King Jr. marching together from Selma to Montgomery. All this led to many great accomplishments in the name of civil rights. In other words, we make a pretty good team. So what happened? Two things: the Black Power movement and Israel. Let's start with the Black Power movement, though I would like to add as a caveat that the following, especially when I'm talking about Israel, will be a gross oversimplification. Partly because I'm hoping to keep this under the 1 hour mark, the video, and mostly because I don't want to be tarred, feathered, and dragged through the metaphysical streets of the internet. Yeah, so the Black Power movement emerged from the civil rights movement as a response to criticisms that the civil rights movement was too slow to create change and too subject to white influence. The Black Power movement was far more radical and advocated for the armament of Black people and against integration into and assimilation to a racist white society. So no, I have a dream that little Black boys and little Black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and little white girls. As you might have picked up from my tone, I'm not a big fan of that mentality, the first one, not the Martin Luther King one, though I certainly understand where this more frustrated sentiment comes from. But I'm also just not really a big fan of radicals in general, and am a rather strong believer that the only change that truly lasts is slow change. But, as you might suspect, my aversion to that particular sentiment was shared by a lot of Jews back then who felt it was unjust to dismiss an entire race as a whole on account of a systemic injustice, but more importantly, were scared by the increased violence and threat of violence. Because, while anti-Semitism was still a staple of day-to-day life, Jewish people, in general, not all Jewish people, were doing pretty well in the society that the Black Power movement was so ardently against. Now, there's a lot of stuff to acknowledge here, and I really hate doing this because it sounds like a bunch of phony buzzwords, but I have to do it anyway at some point, just to make sure I'm checking off all my boxes. So, let's see. White savior trope, including the white people who participated in the civil rights movement, it's problematic. Jewish racism, very problematic. As is Black anti-Semitism. Malcolm X, loved his autobiography, and I do actually think he was an incredibly nuanced, if somewhat bigoted individual. He's also very problematic. Everything is problematic. This sounds really sarcastic. I do actually think all of these things are problematic. I just really hate saying the word problematic. The problem is, everything and everyone is in some way problematic. That's because humans aren't NPCs. We're 8 billion and growing, God, complex systems full of different values, issues, and experiences, all interacting and forming into little groups that interact and fight with each other, while at the same time the millions of pieces that form the group are interacting and fighting with each other as well. It's not to excuse problematic behavior, but rather the bigger picture I try to keep in mind when judging the world and people around me. Obviously some behavior needs to be called out or cancelled, but maybe we can do so from a less, obnoxiously high horse. Anyway, a lot of this was just me trying to cover my bases in a way that mostly is there to explain and defend my thinking. What can I say? The internet terrifies me, and this is more or less only my second time doing anything like this. Yeah. So where were we? Alright, the underlying tensions that always existed are ceasing to be underlying and are becoming more pronounced topics of discussion as the Black Power movement begins to become a major player in America. This coincides and is slightly preceded by the tensions in Israel, which I did promise I'd come back to. So, anyone who knows anything about Israel probably knows why I, as a half-Jew, a half-German, who also considers herself fully Jewish and fully German, might not feel totally comfortable talking about this. That's okay though. These topics are meant to feel uncomfortable. If you feel morally secure on this total mess of an issue, then A, it must be really nice, and B, you're probably a brainwashed fanatic on one side or the other. However, I'm not here to give my geopolitical position on the Middle East, besides that bombing a bunch of innocent civilians is a pretty stupid and pretty much morally indefensible way of trying to destroy Hamas that will almost definitely just lead to the creation of a bunch of new Hamas-adjacent groups. And I also think the hostages should be returned. You see? Two thoughts at once. Okay, I need to stop getting into this. My main point in bringing up the generation-spanning Israeli-Palestinian conflict is to talk about how it affected the Black and Jewish relationships. So while doing my best to keep in mind that neither Black nor Jewish Americans exist as a monolith, and that these are broad, sweeping generalizations, let me break this down. The whole Zionism and Israel thing was not really a major issue until the 1967 war, which you might know as the Six-Day War, where Israel took control of and after which occupied several territories, including Gaza and the West Bank, that, according to the United Nations initial division of land, were supposed to belong to the Palestinians. This led to various levels of criticism leveled against Israel by some Black Americans, including prominent members of the Black Power movement such as Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X, who, Actually, by the way, once said that the fatal mistake made by the Jewish population in Europe was assimilating, and that it was because of that the Holocaust happened. It is slightly insane, in my opinion, simply in my opinion, to blame the Holocaust on assimilation, but it does highlight another important similarity between the blacks and Jews, which is this fear of assimilation, which I mentioned earlier. The Black Power movement was broadly pro-segregation and advocated for black separatism, a worldview that has interesting parallels with Zionism, in that it is, in its extremes, basically advocating for the same thing but for different groups / minorities. I understand both, I really do have understanding for both, but I am convinced by neither. Anyway, phew, got that out of the way, I think. I'm gonna link to several articles in the description below that get into more detail regarding the modern relationship between Black Americans and Jewish Americans. Yeah. Can you believe this is all for the review section of the video? That reminds me, I do need to finish the point I was giving context to. The Heaven and Earth grocery store takes place both before all this happened and after all this happened, though primarily before. While McBride does not hesitate to show the tensions and differences between the Black and Jewish communities in Chicken Hill, as well as the tensions and differences within each community individually, he also shows what we can do when we come together. The novel's main plot revolves around the threat against and rescue of Dodo, which is incredibly symbolical for our times, when thought about allegorically. Going into this review, I wanted to talk about the American hierarchy of minorities. But I didn't just want to explain and prove it. I wanted to explain, or rather reveal how McBride explains, that we move past and above it. Dodo is Black, but as a character he is representative of another minority, the disabled community. When America, the system, wants to lock him up and separate him from society, it is through the joint effort of the Black and Jewish folk that he is rescued, and not just by any Black or Jewish folk, by the ones who live in society and flourish while still embracing their heritage and identity, aka they exist without entirely assimilating to or rejecting America. They are the ones who are able to save Dodo. When minorities stop participating in the hierarchy of minorities and stop competing against each other for a spot at the table and instead help each other up and strengthen one another, it is then that they are able to have their cake and eat it too. That is how you achieve equality. Not by becoming the same as those above you, or stepping on the backs of those below you, but by creating a society that sees different stories and peoples as equal, and when it comes down to the humanity in each of us, sees us as very similar indeed. In telling the story of Dodo, McBride shows what Black and Jewish Americans are capable of when they work together, what all minorities can do when they celebrate their intersections and value their differences. At the start of the book, when the police come to question Malachi, he tells them that, just like the mezuzah, Jewish life is portable. This can be interpreted in many ways. My favorite personal interpretation, however, is not just that Jews can adapt anywhere, but they can also adapt to anything. What it means to be Jewish may change as you begin to assimilate to the society you wind up in, but the religion and ethnicity itself will find a way to survive through partial or even nearly total assimilation. I say nearly because I reject the idea of total assimilation as impossible, but also undesirable, and even when it is perceived as desirable, that is only due to the person being raised in a society which operates solely within the hierarchy of minorities, where you don't see any other option. I believe the idea that Jewish life is portable is applicable to any identity. Societies may change, you may change, but who you are is always with you in some form of another. This is because of the strength of ourselves and our communities. It is also because, as Dr. King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. The hurricane at the start of the novel is that eventual justice. It is nature, or even God's harbinger, as it cleanses, as if in reference to the Great Flood, Chicken Hill of its sins and allows it to start anew. It allows Malachi to escape, and it coincides with Dodo's peaceful passing, showing us that, while not all is right with the world, we are perhaps making our way there. Now, this may be one point on which I disagree with McBride and Dr. King on. I don't believe it will be a hurricane or an act of God which tips the scales back into balance, though I'm sure neither would believe it to be as simple as that either. However, I do believe that humanity is a pendulum of extremes, always swinging back and forth where the center is justice. We swing wildly now, But even a pendulum slows, as worlds evolve and people change, not inherently, but as a web of communities being spun closer and closer together. The world now would have been unrecognizable 500 years ago, and I'm sure it will be similarly so 500 years from now. If it is for bad or good, that will not be due to a higher power. It will be due to us.